the musket ball that shattered the morning silence at Lexington Green on April 19, 1775, would echo through history as the shot heard round the world. But the seeds of this confrontation had been planted years earlier, in the cobblestone streets of Boston, where British soldiers and American colonists eyed each other with growing suspicion and barely contained rage. General Thomas Gage stood at the window of Province House, watching the bustling activity in Boston Harbor below. The Massachusetts royal governor knew he was sitting atop a powder keg. Ever since the Boston Tea Party in 1773, relations between the Crown and the colonists had deteriorated rapidly. The intolerable acts, passed by Parliament as punishment for the Tea Party, had only served to unite the colonies in their opposition to British rule. The morning mist hung heavy over Concord as Major John Pitcairn led his light infantry through the countryside. Their mission was simple: destroy the colonial militia's weapons cache and arrest the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. What Gage hadn't anticipated was the efficiency of the colonial intelligence network. Paul Revere and William Dawes had already thundered through the night. Their warning cries of the British are coming, rousing the countryside died at Lexington. Captain John Parker assembled his 7-7 Minutemen on the village green. These were farmers and merchants, blacksmiths and clerks, ordinary men who had pledged to be ready at a minute's notice to defend their communities. As the scarlet-coated British regulars marched into view, Parker reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The confrontation lasted mere minutes, but its consequences would span centuries. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead on the green, and the British column pressed on toward Concord. At the North Bridge in Concord, however, the tables turned. The colonial militia had grown to nearly 400 men, and when British soldiers attempted to destroy military supplies, the Americans opened fire. Major Buttrick's cry of "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire," marked the moment when colonial resistance transformed into open rebellion. The British retreat from Concord became a nightmare of running battles and sniper fire. Colonial militiamen, using tactics learned from decades of frontier warfare, harassed the British column from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. By the time the exhausted regulars reached the safety of Bunker Hill in Charlestown, they had suffered over 270 casualties. News of the battle spread like wildfire throughout New England. Church bells rang in distant villages, and riders galloped along country roads carrying word of the bloodshed. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Providence, Rhode Island, militia companies grabbed their muskets and began the march toward Boston. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress issued a call to arms that would bring thousands of colonial fighters converging on the port city. Historical context reference from David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive work Paul Revere's Ride, which provides detailed accounts of these pivotal events within days of Lexington and Concord. An informal siege of Boston had begun. Colonial forces, numbering initially around 15,000 men, established positions on the hills and peninsulas surrounding the city. The British Army, along with thousands of loyalist civilians, found themselves trapped on the Boston Peninsula, supplied only by ships from the harbor. What had started as a simple mission to confiscate weapons had escalated into the opening shots of what would become the American Revolution. The die was cast, and neither side could retreat from the precipice they now faced. The ramshackle collection of militia companies surrounding Boston in late April 1775 bore little resemblance to a professional army. Men from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island had rushed to the scene with whatever weapons they could find, creating a chaotic assemblage of farmers, merchants, and artisans united only by their anger at British oppression. Dr. Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, found himself trying to coordinate this unwieldy force. The colonial militiamen were brave and determined, but they lacked unified command, adequate supplies, and military discipline. Some units consisted of neighbors who had known each other since childhood. Others were strangers thrown together by circumstance. They camped in crude shelters, struggled with sanitation, and often returned home when their enlistments expired or when harvest time demanded their attention. Inside Boston, General Gage watched the growing colonial army with increasing concern. His 5,000 British regulars were seasoned professionals, veterans of campaigns in Europe and North America, but they were effectively prisoners on the Boston Peninsula. The narrow neck of land connecting Boston to the mainland was firmly controlled by colonial forces. and British ships in the harbor provided the only lifeline for supplies and reinforcements. The situation grew more complex when news arrived that Fort Ticonderoga had fallen to colonial forces. Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, joined by Benedict Arnold's Connecticut Volunteers, had captured the strategic fortress on May 10, 1775. More importantly, they had seized nearly 60 pieces of artillery, weapons that could prove decisive in any siege of Boston. On May 25, 1775, 3 British ships arrived at Boston Harbor carrying reinforcements, and 3 of Britain's most experienced generals, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. These men, veterans of the 7 Years' War, brought fresh perspective to the deteriorating situation. They immediately began planning operations to break the colonial stranglehold on the city. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, faced the daunting task of transforming this regional conflict into a coordinated colonial effort. John Adams of Massachusetts argued passionately for the creation of a continental army, while more moderate delegates hoped for reconciliation with Britain. The debates were intense, with men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania advocating for one final petition to King George III. On June 15, 1775, Congress made a momentous decision. They appointed George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington's selection was both strategic and symbolic. As a Virginian, he represented the commitment of the Southern colonies to what had begun as a New England conflict. His military experience, wealth, and commanding presence made him the natural choice to lead the colonial forces. Washington accepted the appointment with characteristic humility, telling Congress, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He refused any salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. On June 21st, he set out from Philadelphia for Boston, carrying with him congressional authority to organize and lead what would become America's first national army. The journey to Boston took Washington through New York and Connecticut, where he witnessed firsthand the enthusiasm of colonists rallying to the cause. Everywhere he stopped, local officials and militia officers sought his guidance. The tall Virginian, resplendent in his blue and buff uniform, embodied the colonial determination to resist British tyranny. As Washington traveled north, events in Boston were moving rapidly toward another bloody confrontation. The colonial forces had grown to nearly 17,000 men, and their commanders were planning to fortify Dorchester Heights, the strategic high ground south of the city. The British, recognizing the threat this would pose to their position, prepared their own offensive operations. The stage was set for the next major engagement of what was no longer simply a local rebellion, but the birth struggle of a new nation, seeking its independence from the world's most powerful empire. The oppressive heat of June 17, 1775, settled over the Charlestown Peninsula like a heavy blanket as colonial forces worked frantically through the night to fortify Breed's Hill. Colonel William Prescott, leading about 1,000 Massachusetts militiamen and Connecticut troops, had received orders to fortify Bunker Hill, but had chosen the lower, more exposed Breed's Hill instead, placing his men dangerously close to British positions in Boston. As dawn broke, British sentries aboard HMS Lavely spotted the crude earthen redoubt that had appeared overnight on the hill. The warship immediately opened fire, and the thunderous cannon blast awakened both armies to the reality that another major battle was imminent. General Gage, studying the colonial fortifications through his spyglass, realized that these positions commanded Boston Harbor and could make the British position in the city untenable. The British plan was straightforward. A frontal assault by 2,200 regulars under General William Howe would overwhelm the colonial defenses and demonstrate British military superiority once and for all. Howe, confident in his professional soldiers' ability to sweep aside what he considered a rabble of farmers and shopkeepers, prepared for what he expected to be a quick and decisive victory. Dr. Joseph Warren, recently appointed a major general by the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, arrived at the redoubt as British preparations intensified. The prominent Boston physician and political leader had become one of the most influential voices in the colonial resistance movement. His presence on Breed's Hill, rifle in hand alongside common soldiers, symbolized the commitment of colonial leadership to their cause. The British bombardment intensified as the morning progressed. Warships in the harbor and artillery batteries on Copp's Hill pounded the colonial positions, while British forces assembled on the beaches of Charlestown for their assault. Howe divided his force into 2 columns. One would attack the redoubt directly, while the other would attempt to outflank the colonial left wing along the Mystic River beach. These tactical details are corroborated by Richard Ketchum's definitive account Decisive Day, the Battle for Bunker Hill, which provides extensive analysis of the engagement's strategic importance. Colonel Prescott walked among his men as British shot whistled overhead, his calm demeanor helping to steady nerves among soldiers who had never faced such intense artillery fire. Many of the colonial fighters were armed with fowling pieces and hunting rifles rather than military muskets, but their marksmanship, honed by years of hunting in New England forests, would prove devastatingly effective at close range. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Howe's forces began their advance up Reed's Hill. The British regulars, despite the sweltering heat, maintained their formation and pressed forward in their heavy wool uniforms, carrying full packs and equipment. The colonial defenders, following Prescott's legendary instruction to not fire until you see the whites of their eyes, waited with grim determination. The first British assault crumbled under withering colonial fire. Howe's men, advancing in neat formations across open ground, presented perfect targets for the hidden colonial marksman. The general's aide was killed beside him, and casualties mounted terribly as the redcoats struggled up the steep hillside. The British fell back in disorder, leaving the slope littered with scarlet-coated bodies. The second assault met the same fate. British discipline and training proved inadequate against colonial determination in superior defensive positions. Howe himself later admitted that the carnage was unlike anything he had witnessed in 20 years of military service. The colonial defenders, many fighting their first major battle, had twice repulsed professional European soldiers. The third assault succeeded only because the colonial forces had exhausted their ammunition. As British bayonets finally reached the redoubt, hand-to-hand fighting erupted across the fortifications. Dr. Warren fell with a musket ball through his head, becoming the most prominent colonial casualty of the battle. The defenders fought with clubbed muskets, stones, and bare fists before finally retreating across Charlestown Neck under heavy fire. The Battle of Bunker Hill ended in technical British victory, but at a catastrophic cost. Over 1,000 British casualties, including 92 officers, devastated Howe's army. The colonial losses numbered around 400, including many experienced leaders. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that American forces could stand against British regulars in open combat, providing an enormous boost to colonial morale throughout the 13 colonies. The dust of Bunker Hill had barely settled when George Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 2nd, 1775, to assume command of what Congress had optimistically named the Continental Army. The tall Virginian, accompanied by his military secretary Joseph Reed and fellow generals Charles Lee and Philip Schuyler, found a situation far more chaotic than he had anticipated during his journey from Philadelphia. The colonial forces surrounding Boston numbered nearly 17,000 men on paper, but Washington quickly discovered that many existed only in the imagination of their officers. Entire regiments had melted away as soldiers returned home for harvest. Expired enlistments went unrenewed, and the harsh realities of military life drove away those who had answered the initial call to arms with patriotic fervor but little understanding of sustained warfare. Washington established his headquarters in the elegant Vassal House in Cambridge, a Georgian mansion that provided a stark contrast to the crude huts and tents housing his army. From his study windows, he could see across the Charles River to Boston, where British ships crowded the harbor and enemy sentries paced the fortifications. The sight reminded him daily of the magnitude of the task before him, transforming an undisciplined militia into an army capable of defeating the world's premier military power. The new commander-in-chief's first inspection of his troops revealed problems that would have discouraged a less determined leader. Men from different colonies viewed each other with suspicion and sometimes open hostility. Connecticut Yankees mocked Massachusetts farmers, while Rhode Island fishermen quarreled with New Hampshire woodsmen. Officers elected by their men often lacked any military experience, and some units refused to take orders from commanders they hadn't chosen themselves. Discipline was virtually non-existent. Soldiers came and went as they pleased, sanitation was appalling, and desertion was rampant. Washington wrote to his brother John Augustine Washington, "I found a mixed multitude of people here, under very little discipline, order, or government." The contrast with his experience leading Virginia militia, where social hierarchy and deference to authority were well established, could not have been more stark. The supply situation was equally desperate. The army lacked uniforms, adequate weapons, gunpowder, and even basic necessities like blankets and cooking utensils. Many soldiers possessed only the clothes on their backs and whatever weapons they had brought from home. The variety of firearms made standardizing ammunition nearly impossible, and the shortage of gunpowder was so severe that Washington ordered his officers to conserve every grain. Nathanael Greene, the Rhode Island Quaker who would become one of Washington's most trusted generals, arrived in Cambridge with his colony's forces and immediately impressed the commander-in-chief with his intelligence and organizational abilities. Despite his lack of formal military training, Greene possessed an intuitive understanding of logistics and strategy that would prove invaluable in the months ahead. Washington's early challenges are extensively documented in Ron Chernow's biographical work Washington, A Life, which draws from the general's extensive correspondence during this period. The political complexities of command proved as challenging as the military ones. Each colony's forces remained under their own officers and often followed their own rules of engagement. Massachusetts men bristled at taking orders from a Virginia planter, while Southern officers found New England egalitarianism bewildering and potentially dangerous to military hierarchy. Washington began the slow process of transformation by establishing uniform regulations, standardizing drill procedures, and insisting on proper military courtesy. He court-martialed officers who failed to maintain discipline and cashiered those who proved incompetent. The general's imposing physical presence and natural authority gradually won respect from men who had initially viewed him as an outsider, imposed by distant politicians. The fortification of the siege lines became Washington's immediate priority. Under the direction of engineer Richard Gridley, colonial forces strengthened their positions from the Mystic River to Dorchester Neck, creating an arc of earthworks and artillery positions that gradually tightened the noose around British-held Boston. The work proceeded slowly, hampered by shortages of tools, materials, and experienced engineers. As summer turned to autumn, Washington faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his army before it could strike a meaningful blow against the British. The enlistments of most New England troops would expire on December 31st, 1775, and few showed inclination to re-enlist. The prospect of losing most of his forces in the middle of winter, with British reinforcements expected in the spring, forced Washington to contemplate desperate measures that would either break the siege or destroy his reputation forever. The bitter winter of 1775 and 1776 tested the resolve of both armies. Locked in their frozen standoff around Boston Harbor, General Washington paced the floors of his Cambridge headquarters, wrestling with a strategic dilemma that grew more pressing with each passing day. His Continental Army was disintegrating before his eyes as enlistments expired and soldiers departed for home, leaving behind inadequate clothing, unpaid wages, and bitter memories of military life. By January 1st, 1776, Washington's force had dwindled to fewer than 10,000 effective troops, many of whom were new recruits, unfamiliar with military discipline or siege warfare. The British, meanwhile, had received modest reinforcements and seemed content to wait out the winter in the relative comfort of Boston's buildings, supplied by the Royal Navy and protected by some of the strongest fortifications in North America. The arrival of Henry Knox in Cambridge on January 27 changed everything. The rotund Boston bookseller had accomplished what many considered impossible, transporting 59 pieces of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga across 300 miles of frozen wilderness. Knox's noble train of artillery, including massive siege guns capable of battering down fortifications, gave Washington the firepower he needed to break the deadlock. Knox's incredible journey had begun in December, when Washington dispatched him to retrieve the captured British cannon from the remote fortress on Lake Champlain. Using ox-drawn sleds, teams of horses, and sheer determination, Knox had hauled the guns across the Berkshire Mountains in the depths of winter. Rivers had to be crossed on treacherous ice, mountains climbed through deep snow, and countless mechanical problems solved with frontier ingenuity. The successful completion of Knox's mission provided Washington with both the means and the motivation for bold action. Congressional pressure for decisive results was mounting, and the general knew that another year of passive siege warfare would likely exhaust colonial patience and resources. British General William Howe, now commanding in Boston after Gage's recall to London, was reportedly planning offensive operations once spring weather permitted active campaigning. Washington's War Council, meeting in the Vassal House on February 16, 1776, debated the potential courses of action. The first involved a direct assault across back-based frozen waters to attack Boston itself. The second, championed by General Nathanael Greene and Artillery Chief Alexander Hamilton, proposed seizing and fortifying Dorchester Heights, the commanding ground south of the city that both sides had inexplicably ignored throughout the siege. The Dorchester Heights plan offered several advantages over a direct assault. The high ground would allow Knox's heavy artillery to dominate both Boston Harbor and the city itself, potentially forcing British evacuation without the massive casualties that a frontal attack would inevitably produce. Moreover, fortifying the heights could be accomplished under cover of darkness, presenting Howe with a fait accompli that would be difficult to reverse. Preparations for the operation began immediately, but had to be conducted in absolute secrecy. Any British discovery of colonial intentions would likely prompt a preemptive attack or reinforcement of the heights. Washington issued strict orders forbidding any discussion of military movements, and unauthorized personnel were banned from headquarters areas where planning sessions occurred. The strategic importance of Dorchester Heights is thoroughly analyzed in David McCullough's 1776, which provides detailed accounts of Washington's decision-making process. During this critical period, the technical challenges of fortifying Dorchester Heights seemed almost insurmountable. The ground was frozen solid, making conventional earthwork construction impossible with available tools and manpower. However, General John Thomas, a Massachusetts physician-turned-soldier, proposed an innovative solution inspired by European siege warfare: prefabricated fortifications constructed elsewhere and assembled on the heights. Under cover of darkness, throughout February, colonial forces worked secretly to prepare fascines, gabions, and other portable defensive structures. Fascines were bundles of sticks and branches that could be quickly arranged into defensive barriers, while gabions were wicker baskets filled with earth or stones. These materials, along with pre-cut timber and artillery platforms, were stockpiled in hidden locations around Cambridge and Roxbury. The plan required precise timing and coordination among multiple units operating in darkness across difficult terrain. Artillery would provide diversionary bombardments to mask the sounds of construction, while infantry units moved the prefabricated materials up the steep slopes of Dorchester Heights. Engineers would supervise the rapid assembly of fortifications strong enough to withstand British counterattacks. Washington set the operation for the night of March 4, 1776, choosing a date when tidal conditions and moon phases would favor colonial movements while hampering British naval response. The success or failure of this audacious gambit would likely determine not only the fate of Boston, but the future course of the American Revolution itself. As March approached, both armies sensed that the long winter stalemate was nearing its end, though only the Americans knew exactly how dramatically the situation was about to change. The evening of March 2, 1776, began what would become known as the greatest artillery duel in American colonial history. General Washington's diversionary bombardment erupted across the siege lines as Knox's cannons, positioned from Lechmere Point to Roxbury, opened fire on British positions throughout Boston. The thunderous barrage continued for 3 consecutive nights, masking the sounds of frantic preparation for the assault on Dorchester Heights. British artillery responded with equal fury, and the winter sky blazed with muzzle flashes as both armies exchanged devastating fire. Cannonballs crashed into buildings throughout Boston, while colonial positions suffered their own share of destruction. The bombardment achieved its intended purpose. General Howe and his staff focused their attention on the obvious threat from established American positions, while remaining oblivious to the movement of 3,000 troops toward the undefended heights. Colonel John Thomas, commanded the Dorchester operation, positioned his forces in Roxbury as darkness fell on March 4th. The men had been carefully briefed on their assignments, and each unit carried specific materials needed for the night's work. Fascines, gabions, and artillery platforms moved through the darkness in a carefully orchestrated ballet of military logistics that would have impressed European siege specialists. The frozen ground that had seemed such an obstacle now proved advantageous. Teams of oxen and horses could haul heavy materials up slopes that would have been impassable. In muddy spring conditions, the silence was broken only by muffled commands, the creak of wagon wheels, and the distant thunder of the diversionary bombardment that continued to rage across the siege. lines. By midnight, advance parties had reached the crest of Dorchester Heights and begun the rapid assembly of fortifications, working by moonlight and the distant glow of artillery fire. The colonial soldiers erected barriers and gun emplacements with remarkable speed. The prefabricated elements fitted together like pieces of an enormous puzzle, creating formidable defenses in a matter of hours. Knox himself supervised the hauling of artillery up the treacherous slopes, including several of the heaviest guns. From his noble train, the 24-pound siege cannons, each weighing more than 3 tons, required teams of 20 oxen and dozens of men to maneuver into position. By dawn, nearly 20 pieces of artillery commanded both Boston Harbor and the city itself from unassailable heights. As the sun rose on March 5th, British lookouts aboard ships in the harbor rubbed their eyes in disbelief. Where empty hills had stood the previous evening, formidable fortifications now bristled with cannons pointed directly at their positions. HMS Somerset, flagship of the British fleet, lay within easy range of the colonial guns, as did every other vessel in the harbor. General Howe, awakened by frantic reports from his subordinates, climbed to the roof of his headquarters and surveyed the transformed landscape through his telescope. The strategic situation had been completely reversed overnight. The Americans now commanded the heights that dominated both his land forces and naval support, making the British position in Boston utterly untenable. Contemporary British accounts of their shock at discovering the American fortifications are preserved in the British National Archives and quoted extensively in Brendan Morrissey's Boston 1775. The shot heard around the world. The British general faced an immediate and terrible choice. He could attempt to storm the heights, but such an assault would likely result in casualties even more devastating than those suffered at Bunker Hill. The American position was stronger, their artillery heavier, and their confidence boosted by months of successful siege operations. Alternatively, he could attempt to evacuate Boston, abandoning the city that had been the seat of British power in North America for over a century. Admiral Molyneux Shulham, commanding the British fleet, sent urgent messages to Howe warning that his ships could not remain in the harbor under American artillery fire. The guns on Dorchester Heights could sink any vessel in the harbor within minutes, and the narrow channel offered no room for maneuvering to avoid the devastating fire from above. British artillery attempted to respond to the American challenge, but their guns lacked the elevation to effectively engage targets on the commanding heights. Counter-battery fire from the harbor achieved little more than wasting ammunition and revealing the hopelessness of the British position. Some shots fell short in the harbor, while others sailed harmlessly over the American positions. By noon on March 5th, Howe had reached his decision. Rather than sacrifice his army in a hopeless assault or risk losing his fleet to American artillery, he would evacuate Boston entirely. The city that had been the flashpoint of the American Revolution would be abandoned to the rebels who had besieged it for nearly 11 months. The irony was not lost on either side. Exactly 6 years earlier, British soldiers had fired into a Boston crowd in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Now, on the anniversary of that event, American cannons commanded the city from which those same soldiers would soon depart forever. The morning of March 17, 1776, dawned clear and cold over Boston Harbor as one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history reached its climax. For 12 days, British forces had worked frantically to remove not only their army, but also hundreds of loyalist civilians who feared retribution from their patriot neighbors. Ships of every description crowded the harbor, naval vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, and hastily commandeered civilian craft all pressed into service for the massive undertaking. General Howe had negotiated an unofficial truce with Washington, through intermediaries, agreeing not to burn Boston in exchange for unmolested evacuation. The British commander's decision reflected both practical necessity and grudging respect for an opponent who had outmaneuvered him strategically. The rebel artillery on Dorchester Heights made any other course of action militarily suicidal. The evacuation revealed the true cost of Britain's attempt to maintain control over its rebellious colonies. Loyalist families, many of whom had lived in Massachusetts for generations, crowded onto ships with whatever possessions they could carry. These refugees, numbering over 1,000 civilians, faced an uncertain future in Nova Scotia, New York, or other British territories, their lives forever changed by their allegiance to the Crown. Washington maintained his forces in their siege positions throughout the evacuation, unwilling to risk the destruction of Boston. Through premature action, American artillery crews remained at their posts on Dorchester Heights, ready to resume bombardment if British forces showed any sign of treachery. The tension was palpable as both armies remained fully armed and prepared for battle. Until the last British soldier departed, the British military evacuation proceeded with the disciplined efficiency expected of professional soldiers despite the chaotic circumstances. Regiment after regiment marched down Long Wharf and Commercial Wharf to waiting transports. Their scarlet uniforms and polished weapons maintained to the last. Artillery pieces, ammunition, and supplies followed in an endless stream of military materiel being removed from American soil. Knox's artillery proved decisive not only in forcing the evacuation, but in ensuring its peaceful completion. The heavy guns commanded every movement within the harbor, and British officers knew that any hostile action would bring devastating fire upon their crowded transports. The psychological effect of the American cannons was perhaps even more important than their physical threat. On the morning of March 17th, the last British transport cleared Boston Harbor, carrying away an army that had occupied the city for 8 years. The date would be forever remembered in Boston as Evacuation Day, marking the end of British rule and the beginning of American control over one of the continent's most important ports. Washington led his Continental Army into Boston that same morning, entering a city he had never seen but had spent nearly a year fighting to liberate. The reception from Boston's inhabitants was jubilant, with crowds lining the streets to cheer the Virginia general who had accomplished what many considered impossible. Church bells rang throughout the city, and patriot orators proclaimed the victory a sign of divine providence favoring the American cause. The strategic significance of the Boston evacuation is comprehensively analyzed in Mark Urban's Fusiliers, the saga of a British Redcoat regiment in the American Revolution, which provides both British and American perspectives on these events. The abandoned British fortifications revealed the strength of the positions Washington's army had overcome. Bunker Hill, Copp's Hill, and Fort Hill all showed evidence of extensive engineering work designed to make Boston impregnable. The Americans had succeeded not through superior firepower or numbers, but through strategic thinking, innovative tactics, and unwavering determination. The material prizes of victory were substantial. British forces had been compelled to abandon substantial quantities of artillery, ammunition, and military supplies in their haste to evacuate. These weapons and materials would prove invaluable to the Continental Army as it prepared for future campaigns against British forces in other theaters of operation. More importantly, the siege of Boston had transformed a colonial rebellion into a continental revolution. The successful coordination of forces from multiple colonies, the creation of the Continental Army, and the achievement of a major strategic victory demonstrated that the American colonies possessed both the will and the capability to challenge British imperial power effectively. The evacuation of Boston marked the end of the first phase of the American Revolution, but Washington and his officers knew it was only the beginning of a longer and more difficult struggle. British forces would certainly return with reinforcements, and the theater of operations would likely shift to New York, Philadelphia, or other strategic locations, where the contest for American independence would continue. As the Continental Army established itself in Boston, Washington began planning for the campaigns ahead, knowing that the victory at Boston had proven American capabilities, but also demonstrated to Britain that this rebellion would require a far greater military effort to suppress than anyone had initially imagined. The shot fired at Lexington had indeed been heard around the world, and its echoes would continue reverberating for years to come.